Oh, welcome back, everyone, to Living with FASD, the only podcast out there for and by folks living with FASD. So this week, I wanted to bring back Dr. Jerrod Brown, and he's just such a wealth of information, and there is so much we can all learn from him. But the topic today has to do with the criminal justice system. And unfortunately, internet searches will scare parents half to death that a large percentage of us will wind up in the criminal justice system. And without providing without providing any updated research as to the whys and how once someone is wrapped up in all that, they can have someone good advocating for them so that justice truly is served for them, not just by them, but for them within the system. And so today I brought Dr. Brown back so that he can help us understand all the complexities involved and why some of us are vulnerable to being sucked up into the criminal justice system and where we can find some hope. So welcome back, Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Patti, for having me back. Honored to be here.
Yeah, so let's get started. I had the pleasure and the honor of listening to you do a webinar on this topic of neurocriminology, which is certainly a term I had never heard before. Can you introduce the listeners to it? And why is this such an exciting topic these days?
Yeah, I've been spending most of my time digging into this field of study the last year or so, developing more trainings, starting to write articles on this. And what I can tell you is that this topic is not talked about that I'm aware of in the FASD literature.
Mm-hmm.
But in the neurocriminology literature, the topic of prenatal alcohol exposure and FAS, they don't talk about FASD, they talk a little bit about FAS, does come up here and there.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think of neurocriminology, it's a subset of criminology literature. So obviously the word criminology kind of gives it away. It's the study of like criminal behavior and crime and
Yeah.
antisocial behavior, violent behavior. When you tack on neuro in front of it, you think of the brain. So like neuroscience
Mm-hmm.
research, but it goes a lot deeper into that. If you search terms I would recommend people being aware of is biosocial criminology.
Hmm.
Basically, this field of study really looks at the neurobiological underpinnings of criminal behavior. And the argument is prenatal alcohol exposure, prenatal drug exposure, prenatal tobacco exposure, all of those things are really biological kinds of insults that can happen
Yeah.
to the brain and body. But besides neuroscience research that guides this field, it really looks a lot at like biochemistry. So it's very important to understand our hormones, neurotransmitters. This research also talks a lot about physiological dysregulation, so like heart rate variability, skin conductive testing. If someone deals with insomnia, that's really technically a physiological based disorder or like trauma reactions.
Right.
This research also talks somewhat about genetics and behavioral genetics. That's really fascinating research. But it's also important to take into account family factors. What kind of home did that child grow up in? Social factors, who are their friends, the community, how they do in school, all kinds of things we need to take into account. But basically, neurocriminology focusing on understanding the neurobiological underpinnings of criminal behavior, violent behavior, aggressive behavior, concerning behavior, just anything that's like dysregulated human behavior, this field of study can help with.
Okay. So what are your takeaways in the research you've done so far?
Well, I would say where I'm at today, this really is helping me better understand complex human behavior. I do a lot of consulting on a variety of cases, not just FASD. I do a lot of work in brain injuries and
Hmm.
autism and all kinds of other things. But by learning about this field of study, it takes a step back. It gets me to pause. It gets me to stay curious when someone's engaging in just really strange behavior, unreasonable behavior, irrational, or even very dangerous, violent behavior. It's usually not one thing you can point to that causes it. It's usually a multitude of things that come together.
Can
But
you
I
give me
really,
some examples?
well, let's say someone has a traumatic brain injury. It's
Mhm.
not just like they have a traumatic brain injury and then they're going to go on and commit criminal behavior. Now, if they have a brain injury, obviously some frontal lobe impairment, executive function impairment needs to be taken into account. But it's not that simple, too. So think about recovery. After the head trauma, did they have a very loving and supporting family? Did they have good health insurance? Did they see their doctor right away? Did they do all the right things? Did they eat healthy, get good sleep? Or after the head injury, were they back in a home environment where they were around family members who were mean and abusive
Yeah.
and didn't really care much about that person? And the person just drank energy drinks all the time and lots of sugar and fast
Mhm.
food and didn't sleep well. Just those factors alone, taking into account nutrition and sleep and then your
Mhm.
environment, these are all when it starts converging and you start getting a better picture of why someone does what they do.
Yeah. Now I know I read a really good book on traumatic brain injury called The Silent Epidemic.
Okay.
What everyone should know about traumatic TBI or traumatic brain injuries. I think it's by Paul, oh, I can't think of the author's name off the top of my head. I had picked it up because my brother slipped and fell, cracked his head on the tub, and wound up in the hospital a few days. But one of the takeaways from me is that as I was reading that was that once you have a traumatic brain injury, you are susceptible to having additional traumatic brain injuries.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if it messes up your balance and you're more likely to fall. I'm not sure what all that's
No.
about, but one of the author's key points was that families typically expect people who have had brain injuries to straighten up and fly right and act normal
Yeah.
once the skin and if they crack their skull, once the bone has knitted back together, once the skin is closed over and the hair's grown back, they're supposed to act normal, whatever normal is.
Sure.
And it just doesn't happen because the supportive environment is not there. And certainly we see that in FASD, is that unless someone's prenatal brain injuries have been
Yes.
identified and supported, people have expectations of how we will act, as if we were neurotypical when our brains work a little differently. So
100%
it's,
agree. Yeah.
yeah.
People with FASD who have no abnormal facial feature characteristics or have average to above average IQ, that can work against
Mhm.
them, unfortunately, because the society looks at the person, they look normal, they talk normal, they act normal in lots of cases, and
Yeah.
but maybe they struggle with connecting the dots. Maybe their memory's off a little bit. Maybe they're just a little more impulsive. And
Mhm.
people then assume that that individual is doing that willfully or maliciously, when in fact it's probably the byproduct of prenatal exposure to
Yeah.
alcohol. In this field of study, the neurocriminology literature, I think is fantastic to apply to the FASD world, especially if someone with FASD starts engaging in really problematic behavior or becomes involved in the criminal justice system.
Mhm.
Because it's not as simple as that person was exposed to alcohol in utero. Now they're going to grow up and commit criminal behavior.
Right.
Absolutely not.
Right.
But what about this? Someone's prenatally exposed, they're born, then they're adopted into a very stable, loving home. They have early intervention, early diagnosis, early support. They eat well, they have sensory processing, language, all the services. How do you think that person grows up? Probably better than someone who had FASD, who was born into an environment where now they're exposed to abuse,
Mhm.
chaos, neglect.
Mhm.
As they get a little bit older, they're undiagnosed. They enter a kindergarten environment and they can't sit still and they're disruptive. And now the school teachers think this child is just a
A bad
disruptive.
kid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
They get diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, reactive
Mhm.
attachment, ADHD, the list goes on. They get medicated, they're thrown in special ed, shame starts kicking in, they have a learning disability undiagnosed. They get older, they become teenagers, they're more gullible, naive. Now they're talked into doing things. And that's the path of the criminal justice
Yeah.
environment.
What makes us gullible? And
Well,
not
when you,
not everyone with FASD is gullible. So I didn't mean to
yeah,
to paint that broad of a brushstroke, but what is that gullibility about?
well, parts of the brain might be damaged, and perspective taking deficits, confabulation, suggestibility,
Mhm.
naivete, social intelligence deficits, adaptive functioning issues, executive function. These are all the things that probably play a role in gullibility.
Yeah. You
And for
just
some
listed
kids,
off a whole lot of the
yeah,
primary characteristics.
absolutely. And it's not just one
Yeah.
one reason why. It's not just as simple too as, did mom drink during pregnancy?
Mhm.
When did she drink during pregnancy? How
Yeah.
often? What kind of alcohol was it? What was her nutritional intake like? What was her weight status like? Genetics. It's complicated stuff. It's not
Yeah.
just she drank alcohol during pregnancy. There's a lot of
Yeah.
questions. Was she consuming tobacco products on top of that?
Yeah.
Or methamphetamines or other drugs during pregnancy as well? Was she getting good prenatal care? Was she not sleeping? The list goes on. So
Mhm. Mhm.
every case, if you're listening to this and you work in the criminal justice system and you encounter someone with FASD, don't just assume you have the situation figured out. Every case is so different and so
Mhm.
complex. Dig deeper. There's probably a whole list of factors going on that brought that person into contact with the justice system besides the very nature of just being exposed to alcohol in
Yeah.
utero.
And I think I would also caution listeners who are part of the criminal justice system to be aware that 1 in 20 people are impacted by prenatal exposure to alcohol, but most of them don't even know it.
Yeah,
Right. So
absolutely.
it's really the call to action is to be curious and to get that early childhood and that pregnancy history even, um what was going on in the offenders family life back even in the months preceding pregnancy.
It gets
Yeah.
tricky too if there's no birth records. If it's
Hmm.
an adult and the adult's a poor reporter, bad memory,
Yeah.
inconsistent, where 1 minute they seem on their game, the next minute they're telling a completely different story,
Hmm.
that criminal justice professional may jump to the conclusion that person's lying when in fact it could be confabulation.
Confabulation.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
that's a whole nother can of worms. It gets tricky and stuff as well.
Yeah.
I do a
And
lot of consulting with adults who have FASD with different groups. And in my experience, a very high percentage of adults with undiagnosed FASD also have head trauma histories from traumatic brain injuries as well. I see it
oh,
all the time.
interesting. So are you seeing any patterns with that?
Well, just getting into fights, poor
Okay.
choice making, a child growing up in a home getting hit in the head because of abuse,
Hmm.
these kind of things. There's a couple cases I consulted on where they did have FASD and they had mobility issues and they fell off a bike and hit their
Hmm.
head. There's another
Hmm.
case I consulted on where the person had highly suspicious FASD and had depth perception issues. So she walked across the street, was looking both ways, and thought the car was like 2 blocks away and didn't realize how close it
It
was,
was
got
right
hit.
there. Yeah.
A lot of reasons. Domestic violence, unfortunately, homelessness, all of these things are play into higher incidence of TBI, but there's no empirical based data that supports it.
Mhm.
But anecdotally, I see it a lot, and it
Yeah.
is mentioned a little bit in the literature anecdotally that more adults with FASD, especially if you come into contact with adults with FASD who are involved in like the homeless populations, domestic
Mhm.
violence, child protection, may
Yeah.
have higher incidence.
Well, I know here in California, FASD now put the stat out a year or two ago that 30% of California's homeless population have an FASD. And
Interesting.
that's huge.
It is big time. I know
That's
if
huge.
you look at general statistics for homelessness, the rates of TBI nationwide in homeless populations are higher than that.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it gets complicated, no doubt about it.
Yeah. And I think part of it too might be if someone is unable to predict consequences, right? If this, then that,
Yeah,
then there's nothing to keep them from being impulsive. And if their social circle is, you know, fulfilled to a certain extent with populations who are more violent, then impulsive acts might really be irritating to the folks they're around and wind up with a TBI,
good. Yeah,
or God knows what other injuries. So
unfortunately, all too true. And we know too from at least if you believe the FASD literature, rates of substance misuse among
mhm,
people with FASD are much higher than the general population. So what role
mhm,
does substance use play in this as
yeah,
well? And it
yeah.
likely does play a role in some cases.
I think just as with neurotypical people, depending on the background, right? I mean, because a lot of times substance use, whether it's drugs or alcohol, it's modeled from previous generations in the family system.
Yeah,
This is what you go to if you're stressed out.
yeah, absolutely.
And growing up with FASD, we're all the time misunderstood and rejected and having to wear a mask to blend in, and that's exhausting. So it kind of makes sense that people would, try and self-medicate with
Yeah, and
addictive behaviors and substances.
when you bring up that topic, I would encourage your audience to maybe do a Google search on alexithymia.
Mhm.
Be aware of that topic. Fascinating topic. Not a lot of research in the FASD world. It is mentioned, but it is a risk factor for problematic behavior. If someone has
Mhm.
alexithymia, they have a hard time naming, labeling, making sense, and processing emotions. And if you can't get those emotions out, those
Yeah,
emotions go in the body,
yeah.
and it's been linked to more health problems, more mental
Mhm.
health, and in
Mhm.
some cases, it may contribute to poor choice making
Yeah.
because they don't know what's going on. So they reach for alcohol bottle, they may reach for drugs, cigarettes,
Mhm.
excessive sugar consumption. So that's another variable to consider when
Yeah.
we're kind of talking about all these things today.
Yeah. I listened with fascination to a discussion you were having on another podcast about alexithymia, and not only tying it to my own experiences, but even more to my mother's, who has dementia. And she's got Lewy body, which means her symptoms are very inconsistent. They may show up for a few minutes or a few days or weeks at a time, and it's all over the map. But the one consistent thing she has is alexithymia.
Interesting.
And not just her emotional state, but and it probably has a different word for it, but she's unable to find the words for interoception.
Yeah.
Why does she feel badly? She just knows that she feels awful. And, I was totally fascinated. So I would encourage listeners to go back and find your episodes on FASD Hope or FASD Family Life dealing with alexithymia. And I'd love to have you back on this show talking about that as well.
The big top, I
So
see it all the time. And
yeah.
There's organic-based alexithymia, where it could be more from degenerative disorders, brain
Mm,
injuries, but there's situational alexithymia that we all deal with from time to time. Burnout causes it, chronic sleep
mm,
deprivation,
yeah,
parental issues. So it's a
yeah,
fascinating topic.
yeah. So out of curiosity, and this is off topic, is there
Yeah.
a different word for that inability to identify your interoception? Which for the audience, interoception is that ability to know what's going on within the body, like hunger and thirst and needing to use the restroom and being tired, all that kind of stuff. So is there a word for that? Or is it a form of alexithymia?
Well, that is a topic that does come up in the alexithymia literature,
Okay.
but there could be other reasons for it. Maybe the topic of anasagosia would be worth looking into. That's an interesting topic.
Hmm.
Not talked about in the FASD world, but anasagosia is when someone truly believes they don't have a disorder, a disease, or illness. It's very common among people with Alzheimer's,
Yeah.
brain injuries, Wernicke-Korsakoff,
Yeah.
where they simply, it's very common among people with schizophrenia, where they
Yeah.
simply do not believe they have schizophrenia. So if that's the case,
Yeah.
they're less likely to stay on their meds. They're less
Yeah.
likely to comply with their doctor. They're more
Yeah.
likely to leave a treatment center. And
Or even I see that also with bipolar, right?
it is talked
When
about somewhat in the bipolar literature
they'll
too.
yeah, they'll take their medication when they're down in that depressive cycle, but once
Yeah,
they lift up into mania, it's like, oh, I don't need this.
yeah,
Because I mean, generally the side effects leave people feeling crappy, and combine that with, the rest of us, I think, would call it denial.
yeah. They talk about
But
there is a difference between denial and anasagogia. Anasagogia is the product of the disorder.
okay.
Denial may be a protective mechanism.
Yes.
There's a lot of overlap between the two,
Yeah.
but anasagogia is a part of their disorder where they just
Hmm.
don't, their brain doesn't compute
Yeah.
that they have this disorder.
Yeah. That's characteristic of Lewy body dementia as well.
Yeah, very
So,
fascinating. And it is talked about as maybe being the number one reason why certain populations are not successful with treatment.
hmm. Hmm.
Virtually
So,
no discussion in the FASD world about that topic, which there should
yeah.
be because I do see it anecdotally too sometimes.
Yeah. So when we were first talking about what should we talk about today,
Yeah.
you had mentioned that in your perusing of the neurocriminology literature, those references to FASD
Mhm.
generally are don't have a very comprehensive picture
Yeah.
of what it is, right?
Yeah.
And more of the, like, a lot of the misinformation infused in what they think they know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%.
So with what you're doing, is there anything that you're up to these days that can shed some light
Yeah.
for those in the criminology field?
If I were to put my neurocriminology hat on right now, and let's say I'm consulting on a case where someone with FASD was engaging in very violent, aggressive behavior, what's going on here? What could be some factors we might want to consider through that biological, neurological lens?
Hmm.
Obviously, prenatal alcohol exposure, but go deeper into it. Did mom smoke cigarettes during pregnancy? There's a lot of research literature in the neurocriminology world that talks about smoking cigarettes during pregnancy, other
Wow,
kinds of drugs
that's
during pregnancy.
fascinating.
Yep, there's several studies that show that prenatal exposure and even a child growing up in a home exposed to parental smoking
Mhm.
may be more likely to have involvement in the criminal justice system compared to kids who weren't exposed to tobacco in utero. A lot of factors obviously going on there, but
So are they suspecting that it's a causal relationship, that the exposure to smoke and the other carcinogens that are in the cigarettes actually cause something to change in the child to set them up, or is it just a higher prevalence rate?
Higher prevalence, it's hard to say. It's not just mom smoked during pregnancy, going to grow up again. It's a
Right,
bigger
right,
picture, but women who smoke consistently during pregnancy, some of this research shows that maybe some of those mothers may have some more problematic behaviors themselves. So then when the child's born, what's the parenting behaviors like? The attachment representation as well.
yeah,
So that's a factor. Another interesting topic that comes up in the neurocriminology literature is nutrition, which I do a lot of work in that area. I actually hold two separate certifications in nutrition. I'm fascinated by nutrition, and there's a lot of research literature that talks about malnutrition, food insecurity, excessive sugar consumption, even excessive consumption of energy drinks and sugar sweetened beverages.
yeah,
That may be a factor we need to take into account, because if mom is pregnant and is dealing with malnutrition during pregnancy, malnutrition has been linked to very problematic outcomes for that child, brain development. So if mom is like deficient in folic acid or iron, I mean, the list goes, there's all kinds of
yeah.
things. So
Well,
nutrition a factor.
I remember from nursing school, which I did for a hot minute way back in the early 80s. um, we were taught that whatever the baby needed nutritionally would create a particular craving within the mom.
Yeah.
Now, knowledge, I'm sure, has changed quite a bit in the 40 plus years since I was in nursing school. But I'm assuming that mom may have the craving for what the baby needs, but may not be able to afford or may not have access for whatever reason to get whatever food has that nutrition in it.
I've consulted on some really tough cases where the mom during pregnancy engaged in prostitution, was dealing with severe mental health issues. The socioeconomic status comes into play. One case I remember that I'm aware of, the mom was pregnant and was in a domestic violence situation and got punched so hard by the boyfriend that they suspect the baby in utero sustained an in utero head trauma from getting punched so hard as well. I mean, the list goes on. There's all kinds of factors to take into account.
Yeah.
Pollution
Well,
exposure. What happens if mom lived right across the street from an industrial plant and was exposed to a lot of environmental toxins? That's talked about in this literature as well.
Or maybe living in Bakersfield. It's not uncommon for people's doctors to say, you want to get healthy, move. That's your prescription, because the air pollution rates are so high. The asthma rates are so high in the Bakersfield area.
Google air pollution and criminal behavior, and you will be shocked to find how many studies have been talked about. Can I just talk briefly about what the literature says about prenatal air pollution exposure? It's really fat. So prenatal air pollution could come from smoking products. It could come from fires. So someone's living close to lots of fires, asbestos, carbon monoxide, radon, all of those things. Dust, mold, pollen, we need to take that into account as well. But higher levels of prenatal air pollution exposure, some of the research points to the fact, could be a factor in premature birth, low birth weight, impaired lung development, and it can relate to more immune system problems as well for that child. So a fascinating topic, scary topic. What happens if mom is very poor, homeless, lives in a very dilapidated living condition where she's exposed to mercury or lead? If you're bored one day, Google lead exposure and criminal behavior. You will find tons of studies on that as well. So
I
those are
think
just a
I've
few.
heard that there's a correlation with lead exposure and violence. Is that
Some of the
correct?
studies say it's again not as simple as that, but you will find numerous studies that talk about children who were exposed to lead early on in life may have more neurodevelopmental problems,
Mm-hmm.
or in utero, more
Yeah.
likely to have ADHD-like symptoms, learning problems. And some
Exactly.
studies do say that it can be a factor that maybe plays a role in pushing that person into problematic behavior. So a lot of other factors
Yeah.
we need to take into account here: attachment patterns, trauma, parenting.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, lead's another factor we need to take into account.
Yeah. So with all the training that you do for those who are like the training I sat in on, and just for the listeners, so the listeners understand, the training I sat in on was the National Association of Public Defenders, and very good webinar, of course.
Thank you. That's very kind of
Very,
you.
very informative. Totally fascinating. But I know that you do several things like that. How receptive are professionals in that field, or do they respond more often with, I don't have time to do a thorough social history,
Yeah.
psychosocial history. I'm just investigating the crime. I just want to give the prosecutor what they need. What's the response that you typically get?
It's all over the map. I'll get emails saying this is fascinating. How do I go deeper into this?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people say this is fascinating, but we just don't have the resources or training. And sometimes you get kickback that maybe people have been doing the same thing for 20, 30 years. Why
Mm-hmm.
would I, why should I care about digestive health issues when studying criminal behavior, blood sugar dysregulation, or air
Mm-hmm.
pollution or lead? Everything I'm talking about today, I don't feel like anything's controversial. It's been talked about over and over and over again in the
Yeah.
literature.
Yeah.
But this is just my opinion. People can push back on this, but the way the criminal justice system is set up as a whole, is it truly working at its best capacity? Because if you
Mm-hmm.
look at the recidivism literature, and this isn't FASD specific,
Yeah.
look at how many people after they leave prison within 2 years end up
Go
going
back
back to
in.
prison.
Yeah.
Look at drug and alcohol treatment programs. How many people honestly are truly successful in achieving
Yeah.
lifelong sobriety? And I do a lot of work in the area of addiction as well. And one thing I'll say about that is look at the literature on blood sugar dysregulation and the role it may play in relapse and the role
Mm-hmm.
it may play in criminal behavior. That's a huge topic
Yeah.
that I just did a podcast on another group on that. I'd be more than happy to come back. Blood sugar
Yeah.
dysregulation might be one of the number one topics I would recommend people start learning about because it is absolutely linked to problematic behavior, more mental
Mm-hmm.
health problems. And it's not just people with diabetes, people that skip meals,
Yeah.
nutritional deficiencies, who consume tons of caffeine energy drinks,
Mm-hmm.
they're likely
Mm-hmm.
spiking their blood sugar levels, which is
Yeah.
crazy making for the brain and body.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely function differently depending on where my blood sugar is.
Yeah.
So I wear a continuous glucose monitor. So I track it every 5 minutes. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Can I leave your audience with a couple maybe topics just to think about when we look at this through
Absolutely.
this? So we're talking about neurocriminology today. I do a lot of work in the area of neuro counseling as well. I'll be doing a podcast on that for FASD Hope actually coming up, looking at why I believe if you're a treatment professional working with someone with FASD, if you were to start using neuro counseling interventions, you might see better outcomes.
Mm,
Another field of study that we talked about during that last podcast is
mhm,
psychoneuroimmunology. I
mhm.
think that research complements what I'm talking about today very nicely.
Absolutely. Yeah, they
It,
dovetail right into one another.
yeah, you can't separate the brain from the body,
Right.
basically, is that. But if you want to start maybe learning a little bit more about neurocriminology, what would be a couple topics maybe to look at or Google or just read up on and just type it in within the context of criminal behavior? The central nervous system. Absolutely, positively need to know about that. And we know that everyone with FASD who's been exposed to alcohol, obviously in utero, probably are dealing with some level of central nervous system issues.
Yeah.
I'm probably dealing with it. I don't have FASD, but if you get overly stressed, overly tired, that can make our nervous system not work properly.
Right.
You absolutely, when we're studying this topic, you need to be aware of other kinds of prenatal traumas and the adverse childhood experiences research. Be aware of head trauma. Half of people or more in prison have head trauma histories. You would probably do well learning about attachment theory.
Yeah.
A high percentage of people with FASD have attachment problems, the research shows. The blood sugar dysregulation, the HPA axis, absolutely have to understand the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. I would say add to your list. I know I'm throwing a lot at you guys, but these are just things that come up in this literature. Sleep disturbances. There's actually several studies that talk about chronic sleep issues, maybe a risk factor for violent behavior in some cases. Be aware of the microbiota, gut brain health access, so basically digestive health issues. And more studies are starting to come out that talk about that within the context of FASD. And a couple studies have actually talked about should the criminal justice system maybe start moving to a point of understanding the gut? And if you can target digestive health issues, would that actually play a role in reducing criminal behavior? I think so, because the connection between the gut and the brain, very powerful.
I can imagine that people would say, this is all well and good, but we can't excuse someone's criminal history or acts based on all of this. But I could see, early in my career as a therapist, I used to work a lot with dissociative identity disorder, and talking with people about, yeah, it may have been alter A doing this, but the body still has to pay the consequence. So I can imagine that if all these things were factored into their rehabilitation,
Yeah,
then that would cut down on recidivism.
I'd like to think so, because these things are not taken into account too much. And again, I'm not excusing criminal behavior by any stretch, but if we could identify these things early on, would it prevent some people from engaging in crime? Or after the fact, I've worked with a lot of cases where they're in and out of the criminal job over and over and over and over again. Start to apply some of these things. Could it help break that revolving door? If we can help the person's brain and body work better, they're probably going to be able to take in therapy better, skills groups, interventions, and make sense of it more too. So I don't think we have nothing to lose.
Yeah, and have more stable relationships and therefore have better support.
Absolutely. And it creates more understanding, curiosity, and compassion.
Yeah.
So we definitely, I call on all people listening to this to learn, at least learn about this field. And, you don't have to implement everything, but maybe start implementing a couple things and see what happens, and we can't go wrong.
This has been so fascinating.
Thank you. That's
As
awesome.
always, no matter where I listen to you, it's always such a thought-provoking chunk of time that I typically listen to you over and over and over again to get it all.
No, I really hope it's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So hopefully, what would be a takeaway for, because I know my podcast is geared more towards adults living with it, but I know there are a lot of parents listening as well. What is something that could help them be more hopeful in terms of, how can they prepare to provide their kids with the support they need so that they don't become one of these statistics, right? Because with good support, we're not going to become, that outcome is not going to apply to us,
I
right?
think it's going to make it go way, 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 way down. So
Mm-hmm.
here's if I put this neurocriminology hat on, and if I'm a parent and I'm raising a child, adopt a child, possibly whatever it is, and that child has FAS, let's say they have FASD, and they're starting to engage in problematic, concerning, dangerous, or reckless behavior. Take a step back. What could be going on here? Obviously, the FASD. It's not just going to probably rush that child in and get medicated and go to therapy, which might,
Yeah.
I'm not, those are good things. But take a step back. Could there be some digestive health issues going on?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Could there be a food allergy or food sensitivity that's undiagnosed?
Yeah.
Could that child, as they get older, be dealing with attachment issues or alexithymia?
Mm-hmm.
Starting to tackle these things from a multidisciplinary lens from these different angles. Maybe the child, maybe it's a household and you don't really think about the role of nutrition and that child just gets to eat whatever they want.
Mm-hmm.
Is the way they're eating spiking their blood sugar levels and crashing it?
Yeah.
And technology use habits too. Is that
Yeah.
child allowed to have technology in their bedroom? Look at that literature. That's
Yeah.
scary.
Yeah.
Is it throwing off their sleep, their circadian rhythms, their melatonin secretion? Is it spiking their cortisol levels? These are all things that have an impact on the body and brain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
These are just a few things that give me hope
Yeah.
that if you started to look at it from this multidisciplinary lens and maybe working with a nutritionist, a gut health specialist, taking into account these environmental factors,
Mm-hmm.
it may reduce that problematic behavior in that child. And it may help reduce your stress as a parent because it can be very
Yeah.
stressful, obviously, dealing with these things too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So what if, I want to leave my adults living with
yeah,
FASD with some takeaways also. If God forbid someone listening has been involved in the criminal justice system, what are some practical things they can do um, to, help stay out of that? Right.
find a good mentor, an external brain that's
Okay.
talked about in this literature. Anytime we can strengthen executive function or metacognition or self-regulation, so
Mm-hmm.
finding a therapist or counselor who understands FASD and doing some training in those areas can be
Mm-hmm.
helpful.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, one of the best things we can do too is improve sleep, improve the gut, and improve nutrition and exercise as well. But obviously, make sure that you do it in conjunction with a qualified healthcare
Yeah.
professional because those are just common sense things to all humans. And if
Yeah.
we can start putting better fuel into our body, we're getting better sleep, our brain works better, our
Mm-hmm.
guts
Mm-hmm.
working better, our brain works better. And if we can do this with professionals and family and friends
Yeah.
who are empowering and encouraging and hopeful and motivating and kind and loving, that's the way to go. Obviously, easier said than done if someone doesn't have all that, but
Yeah.
there are people out there that care, that do understand the
Yeah.
topic. And your podcast is one of many now.
Yeah.
More and more awareness is being made, more and more studies. I'm out there talking about this stuff all the time. Google my
Yeah.
name, you'll find
Yeah.
all kinds of resources online too.
So what led you to be so interested in criminology and um, just behavior that gets people caught up in that? I'm
I
curious.
well, I always wanted to be in the FBI, but I never got the chance. I wish, and I was always fascinated with behavioral profiling back when I was a
Mm-hmm.
kid.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I started to get older and learn about this stuff, I had a fascination with the law,
Mm-hmm.
with medicine and the criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm.
So this field pulls all that together.
It does.
And I really find medicine fascinating when you
Mm-hmm.
fuse it with all these things we're talking about.
Yeah.
And what I've realized is that there's not a lot of programs out there that infuse all of these disciplines under one umbrella.
Yeah, it's a holistic, it's a view from 30,000 feet,
Yeah, it
getting the
is. Yeah.
big picture and looking at the whole person. Yeah, our culture is so good at splitting things up into microcosms and little pieces, little snippets of somebody's life, and that doesn't really work really well.
No, because human behavior is complex, so we need a
Mhm.
complex response that
Mhm.
takes into account these neurological, biological, social, family, and even
Yeah,
genetic factors that probably converge and can create a recipe for problematic behavior under the right circumstances.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's one thing that I really like the neurobehavioral approach, right? Like from Facets, which is Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Consultation Education Training Services. So I would encourage people, if you have not teased out the particulars of your strengths and challenges and learning styles, right? That are the result of your prenatal alcohol exposure, your ACEs, your, drug exposure, your just life being messy exposure. If you haven't teased all those out to get some practical workarounds to help get you on solid ground and to help build up that support with some knowledgeable support, right? From friends and families, to find a qualified, a certified facilitator of the neurobehavioral model. I am one, by the way.
Just curious,
There's
I
that
hear
plug.
great things about the model. I've never been
Yeah.
trained in that model. Do they
Yeah.
talk about the biological things in there, like blood sugar and the gut and
No, but
HP
they need
axis?
to.
So you got the neuro and you got the
So,
behavioral. Awesome. If you were to infuse the biological, that's
yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
neurocriminology in a nutshell.
So what the neurobehavioral model uh, does is it breaks down into like it's based on Diane Malbum's work, trying differently rather than harder, right? And there's a lot of Anne Stryskuth mixed in, but it's looking at the primary characteristics of neurobehavioral conditions such as FASD. It really was created for FASD, but I use it even with my mom with her dementia. It helps me not take things personally. But it looks at, what are the particular challenges in terms of brain tasks within certain domains like language and communication, executive functioning, abstract concepts. There's 9 primary characteristics, and strengths is one of those.
Okay.
Um,
Excellent.
Primary characteristics being those behaviors and abilities that directly reflect brain function and the
Okay.
way we're wired. And then there's secondary symptoms, because those behaviors, which are the ones that lead people into counseling and the principal's office and whatnot, um, those behaviors are defensive behaviors that protect against further pain and rejection, and because they result from the poor fit between someone's abilities and what everyone else expects of them. And then tertiary, when secondary symptoms don't raise the red flag and point people to say, hey, problem over here. Let's get the support they need. Then you end up, with system involvement, whether it's juvenile justice or adult criminal justice, whatever the CPS,
Yeah.
whatever the case may be. But it really helps people navigate, what is my particular combination? Because every individual looks different, neurotypical, neurodivergent alike. Everyone's combination of strengths and challenges and learning style is unique as a fingerprint.
Very good reminder.
So
It
yeah,
sounds like a fantastic program.
yeah, it's a really good approach. I would encourage, if anyone listening is working on their doctorate, to take that model and do the research to get the evidence-based stamp of approval. The founder did do the research, but for whatever reason, it never got published. So it doesn't have that official stamp. Although she did, it did give her the results that she anticipated. I don't know why it never got published, but it needs to be because
Yeah, it sure sounds like it. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, it's very effective. And it's what I do. My professional development trainings is the facets model. And then my coaching practice that infuses other things that a quarter century in child welfare has driven home.
that
right?
comes in handy. That comes in handy.
Attachment, trauma, yeah, all those pieces I infuse into that. Nutrition, actually.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that could be
Awesome.
another one. I
Yeah.
don't do that yet, but yeah, back in nursing school, I didn't like that class.
Yeah, years ago I was not interested. I am so gung-ho now about the gut and nutrition and all that. It's where it's at.
Trying to memorize. See, here I am with my FASD challenges, memory's part of that.
Of course.
Memorizing all the details about every single vitamin that there is. I was like, yeah, too dry. I'm done. Next. But it is wrapped up in everything, and looking at, I know depending on my blood sugar, if I'm super cranky and irritable, that's a good clue my sugar is really low or falling fast.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. And if I'm sluggish, I'm probably kind of high. So, okay.
I'll share my contact with folks
Yes.
if you'd like, and we can definitely go deeper into any of these topics on a future
Okay.
episode if you'd like. And
let's dive into sugar and caffeine and energy drinks. Let's wrap
it's
that.
fascinating.
Let's do an episode on that.
Sure. Absolutely.
All right. Well, Dr. Brown, thank you so much for another fascinating hour. Has it been an hour? It's been an hour. Where did the time go?
It's crazy.
I really appreciate your generosity, and I hope that the rest of your day is pleasant. That's a combination of pleasant. There I go again. Blessed and pleasant.
Likewise. Thank you again.
New words.
Appreciate the good work you're doing, and thanks for
Thank
allowing
you.
me back on.
My pleasure. We'll do it again soon.
Absolutely.
All right. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
Bye, everybody, and tune in next week for another episode of Living with FASD. If you need to reach out to me, you can email me at livingwithfasdpodcast@gmail.com. You can join the community on Facebook. It's a group called Living with FASD Podcast. So name that in a way that you can find it super easy peasy. And we'll see you over there. Thanks, everybody. Until next time. Bye-bye.